Hey there kids, it's me, Mr. Creepypasta, and before we get started on tonight's story, I just wanted to tell you about a new book that's available by Joshua Campbell, the author of tonight's story, Fall Frights and Winter Chills. It's available now from Goodreads and in the link in the description down below. Now, on to tonight's story. Have you ever met someone who changed your life so completely? Someone who's your first, your last, and your only. I met her yesterday. I met Sheila. I work as an engineer in China. My company hired me straight out of college and offered me a huge sign-on bonus if I would relocate to their main hub in central China. Apparently the company had been responsible for many dams across China, and due to poor upkeep, had seen many lawsuits leveled against them when the machinery failed. My job was to check the machinery and dams and make sure that they were working correctly. It's a very lucrative job, and after a few years I found myself nearly fluent in the regional dialect. An American is something of a novelty for the rural towns that I visit. I often found myself being invited to bars or back to someone's house at the end of the day. The women have also been amiable, but I was intent on saving myself for marriage, so we never did much more than kiss. Even so, I never had any trouble finding female companionship if I wanted it. Well, I didn't, at least. And then I met Sheila. I was checking on a rather large dam near the coast, one that filters the often polluted river water and keeps debris from reaching the ocean. The dam had been leaking something caustic into the sea for a few months, and it was my job to figure out why it was doing that. I won't bore you with the technical details, but it wasn't hard to figure out what was going on. No one had bothered to dump the holding tanks that collected the pollutants, and they were leaking out into the dam wall and into the ocean. No one had bothered to tell the workers to dump the tanks either, so a week of work and one pumper barge later, the dam was back up and keeping the ocean clean. This was apparently a cause for celebration. The dam workers took me out that night for drinks. The local community, heavily centered around the fishing industry, wanted to meet me and thank me for my work. A kind of festival was held, and I was introduced to everyone from the village, mayor to the town priest. The mood was definitely festive, and I can remember being handed a small cup of strong liquor early in. The clear liquor was very potent, and after a while, the night became a jumble of colors and sounds. I danced and I laughed and I ate some of the best food I'd ever tasted. The whole village was so friendly that after a while I forgot to be self-conscious about my height or my nationality and just let myself be immersed in the moment. I was sitting under an overhang, fourth cup of strong liquor at hand, when I saw a goddess approach me. Her hair was pale, blonde but white. Her dress was seafoam green and clung to her. She had the eye of every man. She had the ire of every woman. And I remember thinking that she didn't seem to fit the standard for these parts. She was tall, almost as tall as me, and her skin was darker, tanned, and brown. She looked foreign, vaguely Middle Eastern, and I remembered thinking, she looked like no one I had ever seen before. She sauntered up to me, her eyes promising things her body were more than capable of keeping, and extended a hand to me. "Dance?" she asked, her voice gliding out like a midnight tide. I reached out shakily and took her hand. She pulled me up. As the music started, she began to spin me and pull me in time with her own internal beat. We moved as galaxies moved, a solar system unto ourselves. And when I looked at her, I could see her barely contained longing. She desired me, wanted me, and when she pulled me close, I could feel her heart racing in her chest. Her breast pressed against me through her dress, and as her lips slid up my neck, I heard her whisper something in my ear. It sent pins down my spine. "Come with me. Come with Sheila." She broke from me then, a teasing finger tempting me away from the dancers. I stumbled after her. The drink and the fire and my nethers piloted me easier. She broke from me then, a teasing finger tempting me away from the dancers. The drinks and the fire and my nethers piloting me easily. Did you say Sheila? Is that your name? I slurred, letting her lead me towards the beach. She smiled and kept crooking her finger as we got further from the festivities. She led me through the sprawl of little dwellings that busted up the area, and in my drunken state I was in no mood to think about what I might be doing. Her pale hair danced in the moonlight. Her tan skin was shown so pale it was almost white. It turned her into a ghost, floating along before me as I stumbled on the rutted path. She beckoned onward, and as I came I could hear some exotic melody floating around us in the air. Then the dog began to bark, and the melody was snatched away. He wasn't much of a guard dog, some little mutt that had been chained up in someone's yard, but the effect that he had on her was jarring. She recoiled as though she had been burned and took a few shaky steps away from the animal. The dog, however, was lunging at her, straining against the chain and barking and growling like a wild thing. He was choking himself trying to get free, and his aggressive behavior was aimed solely at my beautiful companion. Watching him maul the air was starting to bring me out of my daze. Sheila rounded on him suddenly, hissing like a scalding cat, and the dog yarked and backpedaled to hunker under the porch. Then she crooked her finger at me, and the lovely music began to take me away again. We came to the beach, and she led me into a spot off the main beach that lay behind a strand of vegetation. There sat a hand-carved wooden boat bobbing in the surf. As I climbed inside, I felt the weight of the drink descend on me. I closed my eyes, and I felt the boat slip out into the waves. My fingers splashed into the spray when we took the wave, and I remember thinking that we were moving much too fast for a boat that she must be paddling. I'd seen no motor. Well, the boat looked like the kind of thing that would take big oars and strong arms. As we bobbed and floated in the churning soup, I let my mind focus on the strange music enveloping me and drifted off for what couldn't have been longer than a few minutes. When I awoke, we were on very different sands, and her hand had pressed against my chest and her face, very close to mine. She smiled when she saw that I was awake. "Come," she whispered, and was off me and out of the boat with cat-like grace. I rose from the boat much less gracefully, and as I looked out across the water I could see the lights of the little fishing village many miles away. I looked for the oars but didn't see them. I must have been out for hours because there was no way we could have gone that far in minutes. The little boat bobbed in the shadows, having no anchor and no means to stay put either, and that confused me as well. Surely the tide must have taken it back out again without something to tie it down. And then the warm laughter of my guide and the soft music enveloped me again, and I followed her into the woods. The lush jungle lay not far from the boat, and she was standing at the edge and looking lovely in her green dress. She moved into the tree line, begging to be chased, and in the light of the moon, I dogged her steps as my drink-soaked brain processed only the need to have her. The jungle vegetation was lush and thick. On any other night, I would have been hesitant to plunge into it for fear of snakes or poisonous insects. That night, though, I blundered in with wild abandon, and the deeper I went, the deeper I pushed to go. When I crashed into a small clearing, a burbling pool, splishing placidly, I looked around wildly. She was nowhere to be seen, but I could still hear the music, and I knew she couldn't be far. Suddenly, the burbling pool became a loud eruption of water, and she rose from the water nymph. I must have looked ghastly myself, one shoe missing, clothes torn from my wild run, and my face awash with mud and sweat. She approached me, however, as though I were some Greek god. She slid her soft hands over my cheek and pressed her cool lips against mine. She tasted exotic. like oil and spice and something unknown. She tasted like the grave, but I wouldn't know that until later. She broke our kiss and slid her mouth to my ear and whispered her last request. Dance for me. I felt my limbs go taut, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled, and suddenly I broke into a wild and frantic sort of dance. The music in my head had changed, becoming primal and dissonant. My body threw itself wildly about, my throat erupted in earthly screams of ecstasy, and I felt like one of those ravers in a mosh pit as my body danced out its primal need for her. She sat back against a rock, her dress hiking up to show me a pale leg that I was sure had been tanned earlier. Hadn't she looked exotic before? Vaguely Middle Eastern. Now her skin was pale as cream. Her hair white. Her white hair seemed brittle, corpsey as the moon spilled across it. Her dress suddenly seemed more like a funeral shift. And the green became mold as her cat-like eyes stared at me in the throes of my passionate dancing. I was a beast, a man of fire, and as I danced, I felt my limbs exaggerating themselves to their limits. My legs gave way first, spilling me headfirst to the dirt. I rolled over, my arms still trying to dance, and I saw her creep forward like something from a horror movie. She scuttled, ghoulish, on all fours, and my limbs refused to heed in any commands I was giving them. My legs twitched, trying to dance but unable, and my arms kept thrashing and hitching feebly as she approached me. I could see her staring at me from the soles of my feet, and she peeked at me from between my toes. Then she opened her mouth, very wide, and popped the big toe of my left foot into her mouth. When she'd opened her mouth, I had seen a double row of sharp teeth that promised to strip my flesh, even as they bit through my bones, and the toe entered her mouth, and I knew that I would never see it again, and when she started to suck on it, I thought maybe I had been mistaken. Perhaps she was just playing with me. Maybe the alcohol had made me hallucinate, and this was nothing but an alcohol-soaked dream. And then she bit the toe, parting it from my body as she chewed with an ecstatic look on her cannibal's face. I cried out, but my cries mixed with that primal scream of the dance. No one would hear me out here anyway. We were miles from civilization. Even the fishermen on the boats that might be close by would probably think I was some sort of strange night bird. No one was coming to my rescue, and my body had betrayed me in the wake of the strange song. I was her plaything, her prisoner, and she could do with me as she liked. The other 4 toes of that foot went down similarly. She crunched them with relish. Her serpentine tongue slid out to lick the blood from her lips, and when the toes were gone, she took a bite of the now oddly shapen foot. The blood ran darkly down the nub, and she lapped at it hungrily as she chewed. My throat felt raw from screaming, the pain intense and throbbing, and as she took a second bite, I heard my voice give out from crying. She looked up at me, seductively enough to make certain parts of my body quiver, and began planting biting kisses up my leg. The wounds were red and oozing, her lips now painted with my blood as she bit her way up. I began to realize her destination. I tried to break free of her spell, not wanting to be parted from this particular portion of my body. But I was helpless before her. She kissed her way up my leg, her mouth splitting at the perimeter and ripping at the corners as she prepared to bite through the front of my trousers. And then that bark howled somewhere in the jungle, and she cast her eyes fearfully towards it. She stared in the direction for nearly a minute, seeming unsure of herself. She was rattled. The dog's howl had put her off, just like the one in the mainland had. She stared out into the forest, eyes searching frantically, but when nothing came running out of the jungle to challenge her, she turned back to her helpless, dancing captive. I'll save you the gory details. Needless to say, it was the worst pain of my life. I watched her throat bulge as she swallowed them down, a look of pure bliss on her face and my warm blood pattering down her pallid face. She looked up then, cat eyes searching, and I thought that she might be seeing my heart as it beat in my chest. She licked the blood from her lips and stalked up to my chest, grabbing my arms and holding them down fiercely, as so my feebly swinging arms couldn't hinder her. Her mouth tore open at the corners again, and I closed my eyes against the oncoming rip of her two sharp teeth. My various wounds ached and bled, and at that moment I was almost glad it was about to end. At that moment, I just wanted the pain to stop. That was when I heard the howl. Closer now than I had been. Something big slammed into her side. It knocked her off me, sending her squealing and hissing. And when I opened my eyes a crack, I realized it wasn't a dog at all. It was a wolf. A big black wolf with white snarling teeth and a pair of piss-yellow eyes that looked furious. My mind was a jumble. I didn't ever remember hearing about wolves in China, but I was far from upset by his sudden presence. He leapt onto the woman and tore into her with his gnashing maw. She hissed at him, slapping at him with her long nails, but as she showed some signs of driving him off, another wolf barreled from the jungle to join the first. As I lay bleeding, 8 of the largest wolves I'd ever seen came snarling from the vegetation to ring her in. She looked at them, and as her eyes met mine, her face was full of fear. They buried her in a ring of ripping teeth and furry bodies. Yeah, I didn't waste time. I dragged myself away from the clearing with what little strength I had, making for the beach that had seemed so close with my 2 whole feet, and as I pulled myself away, I could hear them tearing and ripping at her. Her screams drove into my brain like an ice pick. If you've never heard someone get mauled to death by a pack of wolves, then consider yourself very lucky. I could hear them savaging her as I bled and crawled, and I had no illusions of getting far before they fell on me as well. I was leaving a clear blood trail, panting loud enough to be heard from the mainland, and as the sounds of their feet became farther away, I began to think that I might be allowed to die in the jungle instead of eaten by wolves. I had no hope of finding the beach again. I only knew that I didn't want to die as she had. When my fingers sank into the sand, an undetermined amount of time later, I drew them back in surprise. I had never expected to find the beach, and now the sound of the water engulfed me. I knew I might be allowed to die on the beach in some relative comfort. I dragged my body out into the beach, my various injuries, crying out as the sands caked them and was ground into them. I dragged myself forward until I could feel the shore's wet edge, and I rolled onto my back and lay where the water might slide up to touch me as I lay dying. It was cold fire against my injured foot. But I didn't care. The sound of waves would be a perfect backdrop for my last few minutes on Earth. I could still feel the blood leaking out of my foot and crotch, and I knew that I'd lost a lot. I closed my eyes, and I prepared to die. When my eyelids were suddenly blasted by a bright light. I thought it was the sun for one pain-soaked moment. I thought I had fallen into a pain-induced shock and came to the beach by day, but when the light went away, I opened my eyes in confusion. The light returned the moment I did, and I shaded my eyes to see that it wasn't the sun, but a searchlight. As it slid away, I saw it was on a little ship that was cruising towards the coast. When I flopped back down and closed my eyes again, it fell on me and held me in its regard. I heard people yelling, speaking in the native tongue, and there was a splash of boats being lowered into the water. I tried to struggle when they came for me, fearing that they were with her, but my body reached its limits and I blacked out as the strong hands lifted me from the sands. I woke up in a hospital bed on the mainland. I had been asleep for 3 days. The doctor told me some fishermen from the village had heard my screams and come to see if they could help. My left foot was 60% gone. My left leg was in danger of needing amputation since many of the bites had festered. My groin was a tube now. My reproductive organs were bitten off completely, and I was fortunate to be alive. Any longer, you would have bled to death. As I lay in the clean white hospital gown being told that I would likely lose my leg, had lost the thing that, at my age, made me a man, I didn't feel fortunate. The police came and asked me questions about what had happened. You could tell they didn't believe me. The island I had been found on was private property, a native preserve, and no one in that area went there for fear of animals that lived there. They sounded like they thought I was a weirdo, some sex freak that had gone a little too far. And I told them that wolves had eaten the woman who had done this. They scoffed. If the fishermen in the village hadn't corroborated my story about having left with a woman, they would have likely assumed that I'd done it to myself. And I'd still be in the dark if the old man hadn't come to visit me. He told me that his name was Lee. He had been one of the fishermen who had found me on the island. They had left the party after his brother had told them who'd gone with. He said I'd been very lucky to be alive. Many people who ran across the Sela were not so fortunate. The what? I asked. Sela. They are old creatures that live on the island. They are spirits, he said, trying to find the words to explain it. Not like our spirits, but still spirits. They come from the union of a spirit of air and a human. They feed on human flesh and love to entice their prey to a secluded area so they can extend their time with them. Now, you say creatures. You mean that there's more of them? I asked, horrified. He nodded. We lose men to the island sometime. Many villages do. Some, like you, come back scared and broken, save by the wolves who hate the Sela. You're very lucky, son. Never forget that. I laid back down, cold and wanting to throw up, thinking of others who had been lured to the island and devoured by the hateful creature. And that was 2 weeks ago. The doctor said I would get to keep my leg. There's nothing they can do about my situation below the belt. My company's offered to pay my hospital bills and send over paperwork with a sizable settlement if I don't pursue any legal action for being hurt on the job. Told them that I hadn't been injured on the job, but they don't seem to want to take any chances. The settlement would be more than enough to get a home and start some semblance of a new life. I can't do what I used to do with one foot, so this part of my life is clearly behind me. So many things are behind me now. I tell my story not to elicit pity, but to warn those who travel to this part of the world to be careful who you follow home. The pretty face might hide sharp teeth. You might find yourself following your date back to her lair. There are Sela out there still, and I can attest to their hunger and their cruelty, personally. Don't be her next victim. I'll preface this by saying this was not my writing. I knew that my great-grandfather, Peter Whitehead, was an explorer, and had made several trips to the Arctic. From what I can ascertain from his journals, he made an attempt at the North Pole in 1907, but was unable to complete the journey. My grandmother asked me to help her with some of the notes and journals that she kept. She thought they might make a good book. I found his journal entries from a trip in 1913, and I do not know what to think of it. I have not told my grandmother at all about it, and I do not know if I really should. Please let me know what I should do with these. October 19th, 1913. Good evening. We've made it the furthest we ever had yesterday. Based on notes that we had from Perry and the guide's estimates, we were perhaps 2 or 3 days until we reach the pole, but I won't be making the whole journey with the rest of the lads. Cabot's leg had soured from the dog bite. The Danville idiot thought to kick at the couple of dogs who had begun a scrap. Captain Turner has sent me, Salem, and Cabot back to Camp 3 to try and save Cabot's leg. Salem doesn't think that we can. The toes have gone black, the wound reeks in the worst way. I dearly hope that we can get Cabot back before the rot takes him whole. We would need to ration the oil as to keep him warm in the night. Warmly, Peter Whitehead. October 20th, 1913. Good evening. Today was truly godforsaken. Salem and I have been trading Cabot from sled to sled to ease the burden on the dogs. We lost the tracks we had laid only a few days before on our way to Camp 3 and made near to the Hartford crevice. The team strayed too far right on me, and before I had the mind to correct them, half the team was over the edge of that empty black abyss, and the whole sled was falling. We had to cut the lead dog free before the wretch took the whole sleigh over. Atka was the best lead dog that we had. The whole team will sorely miss his leadership and strength. Didn't see where he'd landed. But even now I can hear him crying and whimpering from that icy pit that's now his tomb. His cries are so baleful and solemn, I can't even bear to think of what sort of pain he's going through. Salem checked Cabot's wrappings when he'd settled into the tent. Cabot's legs gone black and sour. The smell's absolutely dreadful. I begged Salem to put the wrappings back on as soon as he removed them from the dark and ruined limb. The stench so foul and loathsome permeated the tent in a miasma of disease. Salem said that the leg will most certainly have been taken. We'll have to hasten our pace to Camp 3. On the one hand, I hope that we can get Cabot to the camp on time, yet on another, I hope we do not. He's cost me a dog, and more importantly, he's cost me another chance at the pole. Warmly, Peter Whitehead. Postscript. It's been several hours since Atka took the terrible fall, and I could still hear him baying and whimpering in the ice-born crypt he's fallen into. Can't bear to hear him suffer like this at all. Cold, dying of some painful wound. Gathered up some pittons and some good rope, as well as a few flares. I endeavored to reach him and put the poor wretch out of his misery. Leaving this journal in Salem's hands in case I don't return. October 21st, 1913. Good morning. I'm writing this from the warmth and safety of the tent. The snow has whipped itself into a frenzy, where our poor little tent flaps and shudders in every gust of frigid northern wind. I went down to the Hartford crevice last night. My pittons and ropes held true, the most ancient of ice. As I descended, I could hear poor Atka whimpering and crying like a child crying for his mother. Every inch further down that pit of Hades, his cries grew louder and louder, as if he knew I was coming. I was coming to end his misery. I climbed for perhaps 9 fathoms before my feet hit the icy ground. I stuck up a flare upon reaching the bottom and began to search for the fallen sled dog. It was little trouble to find the crimson frozen spot where Atka had struck the floor of the crevice. Yet I couldn't find Atka. His cries echoed through the crevice, as if God himself had fashioned the pit to reverberate all noise throughout itself. The walls of the crevice were fashioned like that of a hedge maze, filled with nonsensical twists and turns so that I could not really find my canine companion. Atka had left a trail of dark crimson blood on the ground. He had dragged himself along. I followed the trail until it seemed to disappear into nothingness, as if poor Atka had been scooped up by some giant hand. The entire time I searched, I could hear Atka whimpering and crying. I couldn't locate him, though. At one point I thought myself very close to him. His crying rose to screaming as if he were aware of my true intentions. So savage and feral did his voice become that he sounded less canine, more like his savage lupine cousins. Upon using half of my flares and becoming lost several times, I endeavored to return to the surface and warmth of the tent. As I traced my steps back to the rope that I had laid, I could hear a scraping noise accompanying the braying and screams of Atka. As you know, I'm not a feeble man, but in that moment, I'll readily admit I feared the crevice more than I ever feared cold or hunger. It sounded as if some great creature was lurching through that frozen maze in pursuit of me. It seemed as if it was very close to me at some point, though perhaps that was simply a trick of the acoustics of the crevice itself. Perhaps something divine smiled down upon me, for after fumbling through what I was certain would become my own mausoleum, I found the rope and pittons, and I rose from the crevice. All night we sat and we listened to the screaming and the scraping coming from the crevice. And the longer we listened, the more it seemed as if it were not a dog in pain, but the howls of a frozen hell coming to swallow us up whole. We could still hear the noise coming from the Hartford crevice, and I'll be glad when we rest without fear. I'm setting off now. Warmly, Peter Whitehead. October 21st, 1913. Good evening. The dogs were most perturbed from the noise coming from the crevice and were very apparently ready to make haste from where we had made camp. We rode hard south, expecting the sounds emitting from Atka to lessen as we put distance between ourselves and the crevice. But after half a day of hard travel, the sound was omnipresent as the night that we had spent on the lip of Atka's tomb. The peaks and valleys of the frozen hell echo in a bizarre alien design. After resting for lunch and break, we rode even harder for Camp 3. Salem and I said little to each other, at least not that didn't pertain to Cabot or the dogs. I estimate that we're about 60 miles or so from our camp last night, yet even now, as I sit in the comfort of my quilt and furs, it sounds as if Atka is laying directly outside the tent. Neither Salem nor I will sleep tonight, and although he said nothing of it, Salem and I have both brought our rifles into the tent. Cabot's not woken or stirred since last evening, but Salem confirmed he is still breathing. Warmly, Peter Whitehead. October 22nd, 1913. Good morning. We're perhaps 75 miles from Camp 3, and the warmth and shelter it provides. Salem and I are in agreement that we will ride as hard as possible today. We'll not stop until we reach the camp and the fellowship of the other men staying there. The screaming and braying are incessant, as if an eternal wind sustains the voice that emits the most awful of noises. It must be brief, as we have a long day ahead of us. Warmly, Peter Whitehead. Good afternoon. A great deal of progress has been made towards our destination. Atka's screaming dogged at our heels as we pushed further south. All at once, the noise abated and changed directions, as if whatever was chasing us turned and made haste back from whence it came. Even as I write this, I can hear the screaming and wailing fading away into the north. We're not far from camp at this point, and I'll be surely glad when we get there. Warmly, Peter Whitehead. At this point, my great-grandfather's entry is slow. He talks a bit about Cabot's leg needing to be amputated, doing some chores around the camp. The entries are far and few between during time at the camp, and he does not discuss Atka or the noise they fled from anymore. But the last entry in the Arctic 1913 journal gave me the chills. See, I did not know what to do with this journal itself, if I should send this to a college or a museum, or if I should just destroy it, try to forget about what I read. Please let me know what you think. November 15th, 1913. Good afternoon. Captain Turner and the rest of our party have not returned. Even if they were trapped in a storm and forced to wait things out, they should have made their way to us by now. The ice is hardening by the day, and if we do not set out soon, we'll be trapped here in the north until the spring arrives. Several of the men want to set north to find the missing party, and although I am ashamed to say it, Salem and I convinced them not to go. Salem and I have convinced most of the others to make our way south to the vessel waiting for us so that we might return home in time for the Yuletide. Hopefully we'll be on our way by the morning. I've yet to hear any more strange noises coming from the north. But I know if we stay, the winter here, it will not be the cold that takes us. Captain Turner and the rest of our comrades are most certainly departed from us by now, and I pray that they've reached the poles successfully, even if they're not given the chance to see home. They can see the most desirable of goals. I also pray that it was the most gentle of cold that stripped the men of their lives, for I can't stand to bear the alternative. If we leave for our southward-bound vessel tomorrow, this shall be my last entry, and one I am very glad to make. Cabot remembers nothing of the journey, and both myself and Salem have agreed not to speak of it ever again. He's even gone so far as to burn his own journal, yet I cannot subject myself to the destruction of my own. Vainly so, I suppose. Warmly, Peter Whitehead. Danny Thornton and Joe Tumberland had just finished their shift and were heading back to Central when the radio suddenly squawked to life. Danny, who had been dozing in the cab while Joe drove through the night, yawned and rubbed the sleep from his eyes before responding to the radio's shrill beeping. Meat Wagon 2 to Central. What can we do for you, Central?
Danny, is that you?
Sure, Shirley, Danny said, wiggling his eyebrows suggestively at a grinning Joe. What can I do for you, baby?
You can cut the crap for a start,
she responded. Danny, who had been stepping out with Shirley for the last couple of months, suddenly sat up straighter, frowning at the mic. Shirley was a fun-loving girl. Hell, he had to have a sense of humor to be in this godforsaken job. But now she was all business. In fact, if Danny wasn't mistaken, there seemed to be a slight tremor in her voice. Go ahead, Shirley, he said, now frowning at Joe, who shrugged in return before turning his attention back to the road. How can we help you?
I need you to head to this address,
she said, rifling up the address from a nearby farm. Oh, come on, Shirley. Our shift ended 10 minutes ago. Send the new crew out.
You don't understand, Danny,
she shot back.
I think we have a code 623. Crew members in distress.
You're shitting me, he said, gripping the mic tighter. What the hell's going on?
I sent out John Wills and Andrew Davis,
she replied,
after receiving a call from the Cloak Farm, code 121, reanimation in progress. Apparently, the family's grandfather reanimated overnight after passing in his sleep.
Was he locked down? Danny interrupted.
Yes, all standard lockdown procedures were in place. All family members went to bed in their own separate rooms, doors locked in case of accidental death and reanimation. I received the call at 1 a.m. after the family awoke to the reanimated body pounding on the door. They called it in and I sent out Meat Wagon 3. Simple bag and tag for incineration, but it's been over an hour now and they haven't returned to Central. I tried their radio, their cells, even rang the home address for the caller. Nothing, Danny, not a goddamn thing. I think they could be in trouble. I really do, and you guys are only a few miles out. Can you check it out for me? Please.
Sure, Danny said, without hesitation. We're on our way. What was the address again? She told them while Joe typed into the computer. He gave Danny the nod. Okay, Central, we have it. On our way.
Thank you,
she responded.
And Danny, be careful, okay?
You know me, babe. Careful's my middle name. Less than 10 minutes later, they were pulled up beside Meat Wagon 3, which sat like some kind of hunched animal in the darkened farmyard. Lights burned in the two-story farmhouse, but there was a certain stillness that both men noticed as they exited their vehicle and loosened their sidearms before approaching the front of the house. They came together at the front porch, weapons raised. Danny gave Joe the nod before slowly reaching out and trying the handle. Finding it locked, he raised one large fist and rapped on the door, wincing as he defiled the silence. For a moment, there was nothing. Then came the sound of rummaging from the other side. Then the snap of a drawn lock. As the door was thrown open, both men let out a cry and jumped back, weapons raised, as a man splattered in blood staggered towards them, a broken chair leg draped on the floor behind him. For a moment he stood there, wavering, before sinking to his knees, falling heavily against the floor jamb, revealing the old man who stood directly behind him. The old party's eyes widened as he saw the two guns pointed at him. "Don't shoot!" he exclaimed, throwing his hands up in the air. "My name's Dr. Robert Shaw, and this," he said, placing his hand on the other man's blood-soaked shoulder, "is my son-in-law, Mr. David Tomlinson." "Come towards me," Danny said, motioning with his gun to the old party. The other man also started to rise. "Not you. You stay right there. Joe, you keep him covered," he said, pushing the old man up against the van and checking him for weapons. "If he so much as blinks, you put a bullet through his face." "You got it," Joe said, drawing a bead on the blood-soaked man. "Okay," Danny said, turning the old man around to face him. "You take a seat right there on the floor, Doc," he said, motioning at the muddy floor. The old man looked at the floor with disdain, but did as he was ordered, grimacing as the cold mud soaked through the knees of his trouser legs. "Okay," Danny said, addressing the blood-soaked figure. "First things first. Are you bit?" For a moment the man didn't answer, before slowly shaking his head. "Right. Lose the club. Slowly walk towards me." The man did as he was bid, slowly rising to his feet and staggering forward. "It's close enough," Danny barked. "Now turn around and face the door and don't move. Not so much as a fucking inch, or my partner here will blow your head off. Joe, you got him?" "Sure thing," Joe said, pointing his gun at the swaying man. Danny was glad to see his partner's hand was rock steady. "All right, I'm gonna go get the scanner. Everyone stay cool, everything will be cool." That said, he holstered his gun and ran to the ambulance, throwing open the door and grabbing a scanner off the side of the dashboard, quickly returning to the other man. "Okay," he said. "I'm gonna scan you now. Better hope and pray that you aren't lying to us. You know what's gonna happen if this thing turns red." The other man nodded. "All right, then," Danny said. "Let's get this done." Taking a deep breath, he took a step back and drew his weapon, resting the cold metal barrel against the other man's head. He raised the scanner and pressed the button for a moment. The thing hummed to life as it scanned the blood-soaked man and then let out an ear-piercing beep. And the display screen glowed green. Danny let out a sigh of relief, then gently laid the trembling man to the ground. "Are you hurt?" he said. "Whose blood is this, and where are the 2 crewmen you said for? Is there still a reanimated in there?" The man held up a restraining hand, cutting off the flood of questions. "No," he answered. "I'm not hurt. We managed to fend it off. I mean him, my father." "Please," the other man interrupted from his kneeling position by the van. "Poor David's been through so much. Please, let me explain." He slowly climbed to his feet, his hands still raised. Danny waved him over impatiently. "All right," he said. "You lower your hands, and please, for the love of God, tell me what the hell's going on here. Joe, you got that door covered?" "Sure have, partner," Joe responded. "Do your thing." "All right. What's the story, Doc?" The other man ignored the question, instead kneeling down, dragging his son-in-law to his feet. "You all right, David? Truly all right?" "Yes," the other man said, seeming to regain some of his former strength. "I'll never get used to this, Robert. Never." "Get used to what?" Danny interrupted. "Somebody better start talking sense, and real soon, or you'll both be charged with obstruction. Now, whose blood is that, and what's the situation inside?" "All right," the doctor said, turning to Danny. "Poor David's father, Mac, he died of what was probably a massive heart attack in the night. Considering the man's size, we awoke to the sound of pounding on the bedroom door and the groaning of the hungry dead inside." "We," Danny interrupted. "Who's we? Let's get a real head count here." "Sorry," the doctor responded in his cultured voice. "Myself, my daughter, Marcia, and David, of course." "So where's the woman?" Danny asked quickly. "Is she still inside? Is she bit?" No, of course not," the doctor recoiled. "Do you think us foolish? As soon as we knew what was happening, we sent her down the road to our neighbor. She was quite safe, I assure you. After that, we rang the center to come and collect poor Mac. They came post-haste, but..." And here he stopped, looking down at the ground, a tremor running through his body. "And?" Danny encouraged. "What happened?" "We took them to the room. They drew their weapons and they rushed in, but all went wrong. One of them slipped on the bathroom rug and he fell and his weapon discharged and shot his friend in the guts. It all happened in a matter of seconds, you understand. Then poor old Mac was upon them, tearing into them. And David tried to beat him off, but to no avail. And in the end, he had no choice but to retreat and lock the door. Both your men here dead by then. I can assure you we did not just lock them in and leave them to their fate. I promise you that." "Jesus," Danny said. "Both of them dead." "I'm sorry," the old man said. "We did all we could, didn't we, Davy?" The younger man nodded, but said nothing, his eyes cast down. "How do you want to play this, Danny?" Joe asked, never taking his eyes off the open doorway. "Okay," Danny said, straightening his shoulders. "You stay with Davy here while I go take a look at the situation with the doc. We won't be rushing into anything tonight. When I get back,
We're ready for backup depending on the situation. All right, Joe said. Watch your ass, partner. Always, Danny replied. Okay, Doc, lead the way. The house was big, almost a mini mansion. Danny tried to look everywhere at once as he followed the old party up the winding staircase and onto the second floor. The creature was supposedly secured, but you could never be too careful. Danny had only been a child when Lazarus virus had swept across the UK, killing all in its path, only to reanimate them once again in the hungry dead. Those days were dim in his mind, an unfocused montage of screaming and running, fire and death all about him. That had been nearly 30 years ago. A new generation was born with an immunity to Lazarus, and mankind had fought back with the renewed hope in its heart for the future. Now the old survivors alive, but infected with ticking time bombs, were dying, and it was Danny's job to clean up the mess. Okay, the doc said, stopping and pointing to an old-fashioned wooden door down the hall. We are here. Mac is just inside, locked behind that door. He'll be requiring this, he said, passing Danny the key. You keep hold of it till I take a look inside, Danny said. How do you expect to do that without this? He said, once again trying to hand him the key. Danny ignored the offer and stepped past the doctor, taking a small case from his overall pocket. He snapped it open, revealing the long, flexible probe attached to a small screen. How clever, the doctor said from behind him. Okay, Danny said, kneeling down and feeding the probe under the door. Let's see what we have here. He pressed a button, the screen shone to life, revealing the closed room in front of him. For a moment, Danny didn't understand what he was seeing. The room behind the door was covered in some sort of plastic sheeting. Blood was smeared across the walls and lay in puddles upon the plastic floor. Two men were chained to the walls, and Danny recognized John Willis, the ambulance driver of Meat Wagon 3. Chained, gagged, and naked in place against the wall. He turned. What the hell? But his question was cut off by a heavy pottery vase smashing across his face, sending him crashing in the darkness. He awoke sometime later to a gentle tap on his face. He groaned and tried to swat the incessant hand away from him, but the cold chains held him in place. Chains! It all came flooding back to him. The room, the blood, poor John Willis, and where the hell was his partner, Joe? The fuck are you doing? He asked the doctor, who now had retreated to the center of the room where he sat on a cheap-looking plastic chair, looking at Danny with something akin to pity. Now, Mr. Thornton, please calm yourself. Just, let's discuss this in a civil manner. Fuck you, Danny spat. Joe! He screamed. Joe, help me! Where are you? Too late for that, Mr. Thornton, the doctor said, straightening his cuffs. I'm afraid your friend Joe has been dead these past 2 days. He and the other gentleman your office sent before him. Only you remain. Please, Danny pleaded. What do you want from me? Okay, just let me go, okay? I won't tell anyone. You'll never see me again. I promise, just cut me loose, he said, growling in anger and straining against his bonds. Just fucking cut me loose! Now, Mr. Thornton, let's talk about this like civilized men. After all, you'll be making a great sacrifice for your country. One day your name will be in the analogues of history right beside mine, along with all the others that have made the ultimate sacrifice in the name of science. What science? Danny said, shrinking down into his chains. Where are the others? What are you going to do to me? So hard to explain, the doctor said, running his fingers distractedly through his hair. So much has happened, and how to explain it to a layman such as yourself. I want you to understand. I need you to understand that your sacrifices won't be for nothing. Suddenly, his face lit up. David, he called over his shoulder. Please, bring her in. Now, you'll see, he said briskly, rubbing his hands together. Now you'll see all that I've accomplished. Danny could do nothing but look on in horror as a zombie was led into the room, a collar around its neck. Holding the chain was David Tomlinson. Danny scrambled backward against the wall, and the thing lunged at him, arms strained. She would have grabbed him then, latched onto him, and dragged him towards her waiting mouth, except her hands had been wrapped in tape, and her mouth gagged. With a curse, David Tomlinson dragged her away, and Danny looked on in disgust as the man wrapped his arm around her thrashing body, whispering and crooning gentle words into her ear. Suddenly the zombie stopped her thrashing and stood stock still, like some child's toy from which the batteries had been rudely yanked. "There," the doctor said, smiling up from his chair. "That's better. You must forgive Marcia. She hasn't been fed for the last few hours, and she gets so desperately hungry." Danny said nothing, but just sat hunched, his mouth agape. The zombie stood still, didn't try to attack the two men closest to it, just stood there swaying, his cloudy eyes staring greedily toward him. "You must have questions," the doctor continued. "So many questions." Danny managed to rip his gaze away from the gray figure and looked at the doctor as if seeing him for the first time. "What have you done to it?" he croaked. "Why is it not attacking you?" A look of annoyance flashed across the doctor's face. "We do not refer to her as it, Mr. Thornton. Her name is Marcia. She is my daughter and poor David's wife." Behind him, David let out a sigh and began to stroke the zombie's filthy blonde hair. He only stopped when a large chunk of her scalp came away in his hand. With that same melancholy sigh, he placed it back in place and began to straighten the remains of her tattered dress. "Jesus," Danny said, repeating the same question. "What have you done to her?" "Jesus has nothing to do with it," the doctor said, rising from his chair, beginning to pace the room. "Or perhaps he does. Did not Jesus raise the dead after all? Is the virus not called the Lazarus virus? I was there, when it got loose. I was one of the chief scientists at Porton Down. I had been studying the effects on reanimating dead tissue when the damn thing got loose. We don't even know how it happened. Suddenly the siren started to bray and the whole facility went into lockdown. I was trapped in my very own office for nearly 24 hours, while the cleanup crews went over the place with a fine-tooth comb, disinfecting, spraying the place down, giving the people blood tests. Of course, back then, we didn't know how the virus hides and hibernates in some people, what we now call a slow burn. Before we knew it, the virus was everywhere, and of course the dead came with it. We held on to the facility for as long as we could, and I was close. I was so close to a breakthrough. Those fools threw me out, claiming that I was doing things that were unethical. And here we were, the world falling apart all around us, millions dying. They kick up a fuss about a few live subjects. After that, I fled the facility before it became overrun and came south to this remote farm to find David. Of course, my daughter, Marcia. But poor Marcia had already been infected. She was dying when I arrived. Her temperature so high, she burned with fever. She turned that very same day, and we imprisoned her. Of course, David wanted to kill her out of love and end her suffering, but I told him it was a different way. Told him about my experiments and the fruit that they had bared, and how the dead were not really dead, how their lower brains still functioned, how they were trapped inside themselves. "And have you ever wondered," he said, turning back to face Danny, "why you only kill them with a shot to the head, or a massive brain trauma? Why would this kill them if they were already dead?" "Not my ignorant friend," he said, kneeling down in front of Danny. "That's because a part of them is still alive. Then I found a cocktail of certain drugs, and constant feeding. And I believe the process can be almost completely reversed." "You're mad," Danny said, lunging forward, causing the old party to scramble away. "She's dead. She's fucking dead. And how many of you murdered? How many of you fed to that thing?" "Please," the doctor said, hurrying away and standing back down, wiping at his brow with a rumpled handkerchief. "There's no need to be violent, Mr. Thornton." "Violent?" Danny spat. "Violent? You're talking about feeding me to that thing!" "She's no thing," the doctor said, jumping back to his feet. "In fact, in the last 5 years, she's She's come on leaps and bounds. She now recognizes herself in a mirror. She recognizes David and I. Look how docile she is around us. She can even speak a few minor words. Look, he said, ripping the gag from her mouth. Speak, he demanded. Say something, my dear. As soon as the gag was removed, the zombie lunged forward, causing the startled doctor to leave back with a cry of alarm. But she was jerked back just in time, saving them from her gnashing teeth. Cursing, David dragged the creature that had once been his wife across the room and chained her to the nearby wall, careful to avoid her snapping teeth. On the floor, Danny began to laugh hysterically. You done a damn fine job, Doc, he laughed. Look how civilized she's become. You think this is funny? The doctor rounded on him. But it's not. Don't you understand? Can't you see? She's only attacked at the most opportune moment after the gag was removed. That shows planning and cognitive reasoning. You're fucking mad. Danny shook his head sadly. Your own grief and denial has driven you insane. Let me go and I'll put that poor thing out of its misery. I won't even report you straight away. Just give you a little time to run. I'm sorry. Sorry that you don't understand. Come now, David. We're leaving. Wait, Danny said, scrambling to his feet. What about me? You can't do this. You have to let me go. You can't just leave me here. She was openly weeping now. Please, let me loose. I'm sorry, the doctor said once again. But we are leaving now. We close this door, the lights will go off, and her chains will unlock automatically. We've been running experiments these last few weeks on how her senses have started to become more heightened. She should have no problem finding you in the dark. No, wait! Danny screamed. But it was too late. The door was already closed and the lights blinked out. In the darkness, he heard the clank of chains as they dropped to the floor and the low groan of hunger and the sound of shuffling feet. Then, floating out of the darkness, a woman's voice. Where are you? Please. I'm so hungry. Where are you? Danny began to laugh, his mind breaking like a rotten shell at the sound of that dusty voice. When a cold hand clamped down on his wrist, he began to scream. It appeared one day in the hallway of our bedroom, without any warning or announcement, as if it had always been there. I was the one who found it. It was early morning. The darkness hadn't yet dissipated, and I was getting ready to go out for a jog, trying hard not to disrupt my wife's soft snores as I slipped my shoes on. I got up, stretched my legs, and began creeping out of the room when I felt it at the back of my neck. A sudden burst of cold air, nipping at the flesh of my neck, causing goosebumps to spring up on my arm. I gasped as tremors ran through my body. What the fuck? I took a step back. And there it was. Icy cold wind, like the breath of an ice dragon, being exhaled by the wooden frame of the door. Where did it come from? Was there something wrong with the plumbing? I scanned the walls. No dampness in the walls anywhere. What else could it be? Maybe the old bones of the house had cracked with age, allowing the wind to squirm its way in. I had no idea. I shook my head and walked out, thinking I'd investigate it later when my wife was up. It was a beautiful morning, one that was warm and smelling of grass. I would have enjoyed it more had I not been so focused on the cold spot that had inexplicably appeared in my bedroom. Why was it so chilly when the day itself was this warm? Had the walls cooled the air down as it wriggled into the house? The temperature difference was too stark to be explained away like this. I found myself strangely fixated on the cold spot, so much so that I hadn't even realized that I had finished my run and made it all the way back home. I wasn't the only one affected by it. As I entered the house, wiping beads of sweat off my brow, I found my wife in our bedroom, standing near the door with a frown marring her once beautiful face. "There's a cold spot here," she remarked. "I know. It's weird." She cut me off. "I don't like it. Get rid of it." I opened my mouth to say that I will, but she'd already turned away and marched off to our daughter's room. Breakfast was an odd affair that morning. As our daughter sat chattering away about some inane middle school gossip,
My wife chewed on her cereal, slowly, deliberately. She wanted to take the time to contemplate on its taste. "Why is it there, anyway?" she asked, abruptly cutting off our daughter's rambling. I shrugged. "I don't really know." "Of course you don't," she spat. I frowned. "Now you don't have to." "Get rid of it," she said, and walked off, leaving behind her bowl of unfinished cereal. My daughter looked at me questioningly. I told her to finish her food. I couldn't focus much on work that day. Every time the air conditioning swung my way and blasted me in the face with freezing air, my mind instantly reverted to that damn cold spot. My coworkers were concerned, said that I was too distracted. I brushed their concerns aside, but couldn't really get into my usual groove. I finally threw my hands up and got in touch with a plumber and a carpenter. The sooner I got rid of that thing, the sooner I'll be able to get on with my life. "Do you think something's wrong with the air ducts?" asked a friend and coworker while I watched him pour coffee into his mug, with whiffs of steam rising up hypnotically. It was warm, comforting. I don't know, I mumbled. "It's too cold. Colder than what should be possible." "Huh," he said. "Weird." I finished early that day and returned home, whistling a half-forgotten tune in the cold car. I grunted, switched the AC off about halfway into the journey. Back home, I found my wife sitting in the couch in the living room. She'd been waiting for me. "Did anyone swing by today?" I asked. Jaw clenched as she glared at me. "Yes," she replied. And I noticed her body shivering as if she'd been exposed to low temperatures for a long time. "Couldn't fix it." Her teeth chattered. "But of course they can't. I mean, how do you expect outsiders to come and tell you what to do? It's your house. Fix it yourself." My mouth felt dry. Like all the moisture had been sucked out by a saliva ejector. "You're really cold. Have you been standing under it?" Her face warped into a snarl, crow's feet sharpening like claws. "Someone here has to, right? I don't want to, but someone's got to remember what's wrong here." I gawped at her. "What? That doesn't make any sense. You don't have to stand anywhere." She groaned in frustration and got up to leave. "Hey, wait!" I grabbed her hand to stop her and instantly released it. It was like clutching a lump of ice. It stung the skin on my palm. What had she been doing when I was at work? She marched off to the doorway and stood there, her back facing me, her body vibrating as the cold crashed into her. I took my jacket off and ran towards the door. "Stop!" I said, wrapping the jacket around her. "What the hell's wrong with you?" She shrieked and violently tried to throw the jacket off. Ignoring the biting cold scraping at my flesh, I tried to push her away from the cold spot, away from this obsessive madness. She screeched, slapped, and clawed at me, but I used my brute strength to carry her away from there. Heart pounding in my chest, I backed her into a corner of the bedroom. Past the disheveled hair falling down on her face, I saw her eyes, flitting around like a concerned rat. "Stop! Stop!" I yelled. Fear and desperation clear in my cracked voice. "Please! Stop this shit and talk to me!" She took a step back, spreading her arms out on the walls like a spider and glaring at me. Teeth gritted, nose scrunched up, veins of her neck stretched painfully. She looked at me with such utter hate it made my knees wobble. I couldn't for the life of me figure out what was happening here. It was so bizarre. None of it made any sense. "Please, honey," I whispered. "Stop." She screamed and ran into me, past me. She shoved me aside and ran faster than I'd ever seen her run, before coming to an abrupt halt at the doorway, shivering and whimpering. She stood there, despite the pain, despite how weird it was. She stood there like her life depended on it. "What are you doing?" I asked, exasperated as I tried to wrench her off her spot once again. She fought like a woman possessed as I heaved her onto my shoulders and carried her off to the living room before dumping her on the couch. "Let me go! Let me go!" she said, slapping at my hands. "Let me go!" I caught hold of her wrist and pulled her hands above her head, effectively restraining her. She opened her mouth and her chest started quaking as she began sobbing. "Please, let me go! I have to go! I have to go! I have to go!" I blinked and fought back tears. "Baby, you're scaring me. What's happening? What's wrong?" "I have to go. I have to go." Why? Damn it. Why? I have to. I have to. She writhed under me, using all her strength to free herself, but I held on for dear life.
I hit the gym daily, and so often to be stronger than the average man, but believe me when I tell you, I had to use every bit of my strength to hold her down. But hold her down I did, and slowly, the fight left her until she was crying and mumbling nonsense under her breath. When it looked like she'd calmed down, I got her some water to drink. I have to stand there, she explained after gulping down a glass of lukewarm water. I feel it in my bones. Something terrible is going to happen if I don't. I tried to reason with her. Nothing is going to happen, okay? It's just air. Air that can make you sick if you stand exposed to it for too long. But that's all there is to it. You don't understand. You don't get it. There's nothing wrong here, I continued. Just a random cold spot. And we'll get it fixed, okay? Nothing to worry about. Tears pulled in her eyes. I don't want to do it, she cried. I don't want to stand there. Please don't make me. What the hell? I'm not going to force you to do anything. But I have to, she insisted. I have to. Was she having a nervous breakdown? Was that what this was? It's okay. I hugged her and she grabbed onto me like I was a life jacket. I kept a close eye on her the rest of the day. Didn't let her out of sight until we had finished dinner, tucked our daughter in bed, and retired to the guest room, shutting the door behind us. There was no way we were going to sleep in that room, and thankfully, my wife didn't insist on it. She'd calmed down since her outburst and was no longer fighting to stand in that doorway. But I took no chances and kept her within arm's reach. I craned my neck and looked at our bedroom once before locking the guest room door shut, and chills ran down my spine when I noticed a faint mist in the cold spot. I shook my head to clear it of cobwebs of doubt, confusion. Just a cold spot. Nothing more. My wife was not well. I promised myself to book an appointment with a therapist the next day. It's just a cold spot. We fell asleep, with me on my back and her head on my chest. I woke up to an odd, rhythmic thumping sound. Thump, thump, thump. I sat up and saw my wife standing at the door, softly banging her head against it. I checked the time on my phone. Just past midnight. Was she sleepwalking? Was this also a part of her sickness? I don't know, it creeped me out to think that even her subconscious was forcing her to move towards the cold spot. I got out of bed and walked toward her to bring her back to bed. No, I didn't have a lot of expertise with dealing with people who sleepwalk, so I did what instinct told me to do. I placed my hand on her forehead and began gently redirecting her towards the bed. As I got her to lie down on the bed, I thought I heard something outside. I strained my ears to listen carefully. Silence. Must have been my imagination, I thought, as I settled into the bed once again. It was morning when I woke up next. Sunlight was streaming into the windows and falling on my face. I yawned and stretched my arms and noticed I was cold and alone in bed. Fuck. Adrenaline flooded my body. I'd rolled out of bed and ran to the door. There she was. Not at the bedroom door, thankfully, but sitting listlessly on a wooden chair facing the damn thing. I could see the side of her face. It was blank, like the life had been drained out of it. I glanced at what she was looking at. And it froze my heart. My clammy hands fell to my sides and shook like leaves in the wind. I stumbled forward, not wanting to confirm what I feared, yet knowing that I absolutely had to. I approached the door. My eyes fell upon the big, misshapen lump of ice under it. It came up to my waist. It was about half as thick as a washing machine. I bent and I looked at it closely and my stomach dropped. Dear God. A strong gust of cold wind from above me, and the irregular lump of ice wobbled. No, I reached towards it to steady it, but it was too late. The thing crashed to the ground, shattering into a dozen pieces. A small, basketball-sized chunk rolled over and stopped at my naked foot, the ice freezing my toes, but I didn't pay it any attention. Because I was too busy looking at the lifeless eyes, set in the frozen, decapitated head of my daughter.
I hate it. She smiled wickedly and squeezed my thigh. One of these days, we're gonna get caught, I pleaded uselessly. Exactly. She clambered up the chain-link fence, leaving a muddy footprint on the no trespassing sign. She dropped lightly onto the ground on the other side and assumed a ta-da pose. Her curly black hair was dampening under a light rain. A fog crept in around us. If I got pinched with the trespassing, they'd violate my probation. Do not pass go. Straight to jail. My heart raced. God damn it, I muttered, as I clumsily hoisted myself over the fence after her. I met her at about 2 weeks ago at St. Paul's at an AA meeting, styrofoam cup in one hand, cigarette in the other. Haunting dark eyes that have seen too much. I don't buy love at first sight. But it was something like that. The sort of love that a junkie has for that new fix. I slipped on the other side of the fence, nearly falling into the mud. Susie laughter tittered in the darkness. Mischievous eyes glowed against her cigarette. Careful. Soft puffs of smoke enunciated the syllables. We crept towards the massive and abandoned complex of what used to be the state hospital. If this place was still operational, we'd both be right at home. Waist-high weeds soaked my jeans as we pressed quietly forward. Hundreds of dark windows watched our approach silently. I had an uneasy feeling that we were being watched. You feel that? It's like somebody's watching us. My laugh was forced. Here? She raised an eyebrow and blew a cloud of smoke into my face. You'd better give him a show then. Addicts never really cured. We just swapped vices. Pills for weed, dope for booze, nicotine for sex. We can't cope with the normalcy of sobriety, the boredom and pointlessness of life. Susie's kink was risk. Risk of being caught mid-fuck. I guess it's mine too, although I didn't know until she introduced me to it. The thrill of being caught in a place I wasn't supposed to be, that was a rush that I never got from drugs. We fucked in bathrooms, libraries, museums, movie theaters. We broke into her estranged uncle's house, fucked in his kitchen. The night I met her, St. Paul's, in a confession booth, under the angry glare of Jesus on the cross. I never said I was proud of it. This is fucked up, I said, as we walked through the massive front door and into a semi-demolished lobby. I could hear a soft drip, drip, drip. The squeal of a rat. I had serious doubts that I'd be able to get it up. Last week's sex in the temporary abandoned hallway of the hospice ward was challenging enough, but this... Yes, she breathed against my neck. It sure is. She stuffed her hand down the front of my pants and gave me a playful squeeze, then danced down the graffiti-ridden corridor, skipping over a dirty puddle. Susie, I hissed, into the blackness. Oh, look, she moaned. I followed her voice and found her lying in what looked like a hospital bed. She was twirling a pair of panties around one finger. No way, I said. Way, she said, beckoning me with a finger. Susie, this is sick. I tried to ignore the smell of rat shit and the mold. I know, she purred. It's perfect. What's wrong with you? Oh, where to begin, she said. I shouldn't have been so surprised when the handcuffs clicked around my wrist. The other cuff affixed to the metal arm of the gurney. Handcuffs? Really? I didn't think you could be so... conventional, Susie. I then noticed something. Someone. Barely perceptible in the inky blackness. A shift in the darkness. Subtle, but there. It was just outside of my vision, lurking. I could feel it watching. Susie. She stared at me silently, no longer smiling. Susie! More urgently this time, I stood up and I cursed as the metal on metal clanked, straining my wrist against the still-locked handcuff. Something's out there! Get that fucking thing off me! What the... It was all I could manage before I felt the hypodermic needle pierce my skin. Sorry, baby, she whispered into my ear. I felt a terrible warmth enter my bloodstream. The man that stepped out of the gloom wore a white lab coat like a doctor.
thick-framed glasses set atop a bulbous nose, and he was beginning to show signs of balding. He was difficult to describe because he looked so ordinary. The sort of man that's completely invisible in a crowd. I was vaguely aware that I was screaming as I fell off the bed, my handcuffed wrist bending in a way it shouldn't. The pain was dull, and I was becoming very, very tired. Susie! I twisted my neck to see, fighting back the overwhelming tiredness. Things were happening too fast. I couldn't make sense of it. My brain was sluggish, muddy. I couldn't keep up. I was peering through murky water. Susie, I said dumbly. Well done, Susan, he whispered. His voice was like grinding broken glass under a boot. A droplet of saliva rolled down one worm-like lip. Much better than the last. This one has stamina. He'll last much longer. And then everything went dark. It was a familiar scene. I squinted against blinding light, fighting back a headache that threatened to launch me into orbit. What the fuck? That was all I could manage to get out. My throat was dry and hoarse. I opened an eyelid and took stock of my surroundings. I was in bed, in my apartment. Horribly bright sunlight poured through the gap between dirty curtains. What? I asked my empty apartment for a second time. It didn't answer. It couldn't have been a dream. It was so real. Too substantial. I took note of the empty wax baggies on my nightstand. Did I get high last night? What did Dante sell me? My stomach roiled, bubbled, and lurched. I dry heaved as I staggered to the bathroom, feeling the all-too-familiar self-hatred following a relapse. Not again, I thought, as I white-knuckled the porcelain lips of the toilet. I dry heaved again and cradled my belly through my hands. That's when I felt the skin of my stomach press into my palm. My first thought, oddly enough, was an innocuous, weird. But then I felt it again. Bump. Kick. Press. I scrambled backwards, slipping on the wet tiles. My back crashed against the wall hard. I let out a squeak. The headache went into overdrive. I pressed my hands onto my abdomen. Kick. Bump. What the fuck? I screamed. I pulled up my damp t-shirt and I could see a very small, maybe an inch or two incision. It was just beneath my belly button. It had been expertly stitched. Just beneath the stitches, amidst a few black, coiled hairs, barely perceptible, I could see it. My skin moved. A soft press outward. What? What the fuck? I screamed, with a primitive desperation and fear I never knew existed. I dropped my phone twice before I managed to access the contacts. I scrolled to the S's. Susie was gone. I checked my texts. Deleted. Facebook. Poof. Call history. You get the idea. It was gone. What? I still wasn't getting an answer from the empty room. I pressed gingerly below my belly button, and it pressed back. That's when it dove downward, scrambling through my guts. I felt a twist with a sharp pain in my testicles. A memory flashed. The man in the lab coat, scalpel raised, thin trail of saliva working its way down his lips. His plain face had already faded from memory. No! I dropped to my knees in agony, cradling my balls, and I ripped off my soiled underwear and examined myself in panic. I could see something. I could see something moving, slowly pulsating just beneath the skin. I touched it softly with a shaking finger, and it whipped back upward. The pain was indescribable. I felt it worm its way through my testicles, my intestines, and nearly into my chest. My racing heart felt asynchronous as the thing pulsed into a different rhythm. No, 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 I wailed. In a blind fit of panic, I pulled off a dirty sock off my foot and stuffed it into my mouth. I bit down as hard as I could and plunged a finger into the incision, popping a stitch. I made it to the first knuckle, screams muffled. I'm pretty sure I felt my intestines. I felt warm blood running down my stomach as I wiggled my fingers around, trying to find whatever it is that was inside me. And between sobs, I heard banging at the door. I whimpered miserably, hugging myself and pleading to whatever God would listen. The relationship between desperation and piousness truly is remarkable. Thud, thud, thud. Police department, open up. Fuck. I told the wet floor as I spat the sock out of my mouth. I gave the empty baggies a wary glance.
Open the door or I'm kicking it in, he shouted. I don't want to break your door. Just open up.
I'm coming, I croaked. I stumbled at the door, knocking a lamp over in the process. Thud, thud. His baton was poised to strike the door a third time when I opened it. Hi. I was barely able to choke the word out. He slipped his baton back into his belt. What's going on here? What do you mean? I could see my reflection in his sunglasses. I look worse than I thought. Stop it, he said, bushy mustache quivering in annoyance. I heard you screaming when I came up the stairs. Half the tenants in this building called 911. He peered over my shoulder, making me actually aware of the drug paraphernalia on my bedside table. You fighting with somebody? No. He gestured at my bleeding gut. How'd that happen? I briefly considered telling him the truth. The truth. You wanna know the truth? I briefly considered telling him the truth. Briefly. I went to the old state hospital with a girl I met a few weeks ago, to fuck her, obviously. Well, officer, funny thing is, instead of fucking me, she tricked me. She handcuffed me to a bed and drugged me so that a mad scientist can implant a creature inside me. You ever see Alien? Yeah, well, it's like that, but much worse, because it can get into your balls. And if I can chase it back down there, you'll be able to see it breathing against my nutskin. Nothing. I popped a stitch. I had surgery the other day. Ouch. Need an ambulance? He glanced at his wristwatch. You look like you need an ambulance. He cocked his head to his lapel mic. County, this is 107. Send EMS to my location. Adult male, stomach laceration. No! I insisted. I'm fine. I needed some time to figure this out. Anything in the apartment I need to know about? The last time a cop asked me that question, I wound up in jail. No, definitely not. I'm fine, really. Okay, then. He was hesitant, still trying to peer over my shoulder into the apartment. If you need us, you know who to call. Thanks, I choked, shutting the door and leaning heavily against it. Every person has what we call a mental breaking point. It's a ledge where you can look down into madness. If you've been there, you know. I was there, teetering. The thing slowly quested its way back downward, creeping around the side of my guts, probing my insides. And I plummeted from that edge. With the frenzied panic of a cornered animal, I half-crawled, half-scrambled on all fours back into the bathroom. I tore the remaining stitches with my fingertips, stopping only to vomit. My breathing was labored. Small bits of phlegm, spit, and puke spattered the floor and walls. I plunged 2 fingers into the bleeding hole with a desperation I didn't know existed. I felt it. I poked that thing. My voice cracked as I tried to pinch the creature between my thumb and forefinger. It was hard, not unlike the exoskeleton of an oversized millipede, but also serpentine, like an eel. It flinched from my fingers and tried to worm its way back down toward my balls, but I had it. Barely. I felt a warmth underneath me as I pissed myself, and the creature started to slip from my blood-soaked fingers. With a scream, I plunged my entire hand into the open wound, skin ripping and tearing. I watched with a detached and perverse amusement as I buried my entire hand into my stomach up to the wrist. Whoa, I thought. I'm in deep. I grabbed it in a death grip and pulled. It felt like I was trying to turn myself inside out. I pulled and tore as hard as I could. I still don't know how I managed to stay conscious. My vocal cords strained to scream, but there was no air left in my lungs. It was closer to a wet gurgle, and this grisly tug-of-war match went on for what felt like hours, although in reality it probably was just a few seconds. I was sobbing and laughing maniacally as I yanked and tugged. I felt a final pop inside me, and it broke loose. It coiled around my finger and wrist, briefly reminding me of Susie's handcuffs, and I started laughing again as it hissed at me, bearing tiny little teeth. Its countless little green eyes were pure to hatred and aggression, and I looked curiously at the alien creature that was wrapped under white knuckles. I was aware that it was biting and chewing on my hand with a savage ferocity, but I didn't care. With my last bit of strength, I threw that horrible creature into the toilet. It splashed around and hissed, baring its teeth, and I flushed. As I lay in a pool of my blood, feeling increasingly lightheaded and weak, I wondered Offhandedly, if my guts were hanging out. They probably were. I didn't have the strength to look. My bathroom looked like a murder scene. Jesus goddamn Christ. A familiar voice amidst familiar radio chatter. Get an ambulance to my location immediately. Traumatic injury, major bleeding, adult male. I felt pressure on my stomach. A pair of gloved hands were stuffing gauze into me. I take a guy's word one goddamn time. This is what I get. Jesus. Goddamn Christ. His mustache quivered as he pulled more gauze from his little med kit and kept packing it into the gaping hole in my guts. The fuck, man? I faded in and out. More radio chatter and more footsteps. A couple of paramedics surrounded me. Jesus, one of them said. I gestured sluggishly towards the toilet with a bloody hand. I flushed. What's that, son? The officer's eyes were sympathetic, and he leaned in closer. Down the toilet. I let my hand drop back down to my sides, smearing more blood on my jeans. I heard Velcro ripping, and I felt pressure around my wrists and ankles. I could hear bits and pieces of the conversation. It's just talking to him. Seemed fine. Self-inflicted. Suicidal. Wheels creaked, and I was moving, bouncing down my apartment hallway in a hurry. I woke up to the soothing chirps and beeps of medical hospital equipment. The room was dark. My mind was slow, confused. Did I overdose again? Nostalgia isn't the right word. It did come to mind. I curved my neck downward. Neat stitchwork sealed my pallid skin. Heels clicked off linoleum, getting louder. Nurse! My throat was dry and hoarse. Click, click, click. Nurse! A silhouette appeared at my doorway, silently considering me. Nurse, I need... What did I need? The police? A doctor? How does one explain that a mad scientist put an alien inside your belly? I watched a nurse pass by behind the silhouette outside the door. Good evening, doctor, she said, curtly as she passed. Good evening, Silhouette replied softly. His voice was strangely familiar, in an unpleasant way, like grinding broken glass under a boot. My mind reeled. I pulled uselessly against the 4-point restraint I was trapped in. No, I whispered, terror seizing me. Get away from me! He took another step forward and pushed a pair of thick-framed glasses back atop his bulbous nose. What did you do to me? What did you do? What did you put inside me? My vocal cords tightened, and I felt like they were going to split. More footsteps. Ketamine, a woman's voice purred. He'll be napping soon. Poor man. What drives a person to do this? She gave the needle a little flick with her fingers before she slid it into my skin. Warmth spread through my body. Deja vu isn't the right word, but it comes to mind. No! Please! I struggled against the sedatives coursing through my veins. The beeps and chirps, soothing moments ago, now created a horrific ambience. The nurse left the room, and I was alone with the doctor, who stood over me, tracing an icy finger up and down my stitching. She was pregnant, you know. Whew. My mind was foggy again. She was ready to lay her eggs. Her little babies. I remember trying to scream, but the sedatives took control as I opened my mouth, and blackness took me. I woke up on the 3rd floor. The psych ward. Sort of place where you hear door locks snap when you get too close. Something to do with plastic bracelets that you can't cut off. You can see cops coming with empty holsters, hauling off some lunatic that punched a nurse. The residents shamble around like zombies, medicated into an obedient stupor. I've been up here for a while now. Not everyone here is crazy, but most of us are. My roommate Walter, he let me borrow his cell phone that somehow smuggled in. He also showed me the little scar on his belly. You could probably guess his story. We joked about the phone. It's freedom at first glance until you thought about it. Who would we call? The cops? My sponsor? Susie? So instead I ended up on this internet forum where strangers believe the unbelievable. People who will listen to my story. I wanted to get it off my chest. Because I'm not sure how much time I have left. I don't know if the bubbling in my guts is from this morning's oatmeal. Or, well, Walter gets it. Mr. Aldrich, you can come on back now. The pediatrician's assistant gave me a sympathetic smile before stepping aside to the open doorway, allowing entry while I carried the infant seat to the doctor's room. There have been far too many of these, too many waiting rooms, doctor's appointments, special treatments. When my girlfriend Marla first got pregnant, I knew my life would change, but this was devastating. We had met a little later in life. I just turned 31, and Marla was halfway through her 32nd year. She was emotionally reeling from a vicious divorce, and I was sifting through the sinew and mar of my own broken heart. I informed my college sweetheart that I wanted to marry her, and, well, she informed me that she had been slowly moving her things out of our apartment to a new place. It wasn't pretty, but I can't help thinking I'd be better than where I find myself currently. I know that sounds awful. Marla and I became sin-eaters for each other, truth-tellers, if you will. If we told each other the brutal things our blinded hearts had overlooked in order to move on, with all the tension, deep talks, and shoulder crying, of course. It was only a matter of time before we mistook need and codependency for love. Things weren't bad, but I think somewhere in our heart of hearts, we both knew we'd settled. Even so, pregnancy was welcomed. We both yearned for a deeper purpose. One of the issues with Marla's divorce was that she hadn't been able to give him children. She was convinced that the reason she didn't conceive was because he wasn't the right man. As tough and guarded as I try to be, I won't deny that the idea of unconditional love wasn't bewitchingly enticing. The child would love me, and I'd love them, no matter what. Forever. When our daughter Haley was born, our hearts exploded with love, pride, and beauty. I didn't care if Marla wasn't my first choice or how empty our bed seemed while we were both in it. Haley would have a father, and that's all that mattered. She had bright, beautiful blue eyes and a strawberry birthmark on her little left shoulder that looked like an angel's kiss. Marla was concerned about it at first, but I wasn't worried. See, I thought it was the sweetest thing I'd ever seen. Haley's APGAR score was exceptional, and we were allowed to leave the hospital a mere 40 hours later. Marla delivered wonderfully. There wasn't a tear or rip in the entire process. Graphic, I know, but like I said earlier, I was excited to have a baby. I researched everything that I could, and this information was pertinent to Marla's aftercare. We put her in her car seat with a tie-dye cover, not just pinks or blues for our little girl. Our little miss deserved all the colors of the rainbow. The first 10 days of parenthood seemed almost perfect. Then it all changed. Haley began rejecting Marla's breast milk. The baby that slept through the night the week before was now up every hour with inconsolable anguish. We tried everything. Feeding her regular formula, soy formula. We drove her in the car, burped her, changed her, ignored her to cry it out. Sleeping in shifts wasn't possible with such a small apartment, which is how I figured out driving her in the car was useless. I was giving her a bath one morning, and I noticed something strange. "Marla, come look at this," I called out. She came to me breathless, fearing that I'd dropped our daughter, and after feigning shock and offense, I pointed out the issue. Her birthmark's gone. She reached her hand out to touch Haley's shoulder, confirming my suspicion. "The doctor did say it would be only temporary," she said dismissively, waving the worry away with a flick of her wrist.
The next couple of weeks would show that I was right to worry. Haley continued to reject the majority of her food, and when she wasn't crying inconsolably, we'd catch her staring into space. She wouldn't move. She wouldn't blink. It was eerie. By the time her next doctor appointment came, Marla and I had an entire list of concerns for the doctor. Our precious baby girl was labeled as failure to thrive at her first month checkup. Soon after, her skin broke out in mottled blotches. To top that all off, I was beginning to suspect... No, I knew that we had a rat problem in the apartment. All sorts of sound would come from inside the walls. If I didn't know any better, I'd say that something large was in there. Maybe a squirrel, even a cat. There was skittering, pounding, even yowling at points. The majority of the activity was at night. We may not even have noticed it if we weren't up every hour with the baby. Marla got a promotion at work that brought our family a lot more money, but it also brought her a lot more responsibility. The pay increase allowed me to be home full-time with Haley. I was able to take her to all the doctor's appointments and travel to see specialists. Not that any of it helped. The only even remotely close diagnosis for a baby with this condition was drug withdrawal. And Marla had been drug tested throughout her pregnancy, birth, and for her new job. She'd passed all with flying colors. Marla didn't even take so much as Tylenol. The emotional pain, worry, and stress weighed heavily on both of us. Instantaneous, unprepared care and problems thrust upon two lost souls takes its toll. I still love her, and she's worth it. When she looks at me with those brown doe eyes, I fall in love every time. But I'm not going to give you sunshine and rainbows. My life is full of crying, tests, baby puke, and sickening smells of disinfectant. And that's another thing. Haley's eyes changed into a dark golden brown. Now, I wasn't an expert on genetics, but Marla and I both have blue eyes. If we lived a normal life with a healthy child, maybe my mind would have made that an issue. But fortunately for us, we didn't have the luxury of time to make assumptions. But don't think there weren't times where I didn't peck at my mind like a vulture on a carcass. Each intrusive thought rotted my soul, little bits at a time. Which brings us to the beginning. Me sitting here in the doctor's office with Haley staring at alphabet choo-choo train papered walls. Marla had an early shift this morning and hopefully will be waiting for us by the time we get home. The doorknob squeaks in protest as the doctor enters the room. By this point, I have Haley down to just a clean diaper and ready to get it over with. Well, she begins. Diagnostically, I can't find anything wrong with this little lady. She's still in an alarmingly low percentile for her age and length. But we'll get there. Her face grows stern. If you don't mind, I'd like to send someone for a home visit. Whoa, I started. She holds her hand up defensively. I know what you're thinking. They won't be there to judge or in any official capacity. I just want to see if Haley's health issues are biological or environmental. We had one patient last year that was 13 months old. She broke out in hives and breathing troubles every time her mother took her outside. After a home visit, we were able to determine that she was allergic to the jasmine bushes throughout their yard. Anything to help her, I said. I relented. They came to the house a few days later, and luckily, nothing major was found. The only thing they did find was a minute amount of mold in the lower corner of her nursery, along with the molding of the wall. It was definitely a health hazard, but still didn't explain her digestive and skin issues. Her respiration and breathing were fine. Those were one of the few areas where Haley excelled health-wise, in fact. After they left, I decided to inspect the area. Seemed like an easy enough fix, just remove the molding, scrub it with bleach, let it dry. I pulled off the molding, which wasn't even attached properly, revealing that the wall behind it had been knocked loose. The state of the wall was so bad that two of my fingers slipped right through the drywall. The gypsum crumbling like mud in my hands. The earth and toxic smell made my stomach retch and my head spin.
As I removed my hand, I saw the partial part of a foot peeking out from inside the walls. The police arrived almost immediately. I met them outside, holding my daughter to my chest tightly. Marla pulled into the driveway, stunned to see 2 cop cars with sirens blaring, parked on the curb by the mailbox. I grabbed her with my free arm as she tried to run into the house. After she saw the baby was safe in my arms, she relaxed enough for me to tell her what was going on. 3 of the 4 police officers on scene emerged from our once safe and quiet home. We were utterly stunned at what they found. A man and a woman, so filthy it was almost impossible to tell their age or distinctive features. Whatever teeth they had in their better years had been smoked away long ago. The man's face had been covered with scabs, some healed, some kept open by years of habit and miscare. His companion didn't fare much better. Their eyes were jet-black orbs. They twitched and spasmed with jitters of addiction as police led them through our yard. The 4th officer stepped slowly through the doorway. He was struggling to blanket an infant child. I pulled Haley away from my chest to look at her, almost not able to believe what I was seeing. The officer had bundled the baby by now. She looked at me. She was a gorgeous baby. One with blue eyes, and a strawberry birthmark on her little left shoulder. I'm terrified and I have no idea what to do. I don't know when the switch took place and I have no idea what to do next. The police took the baby, our baby, with them to get her checked out by a medical team. We're doing all that we can to get her back to our care. But until then, the child we do have is a mystery to me. Marla's detached from both of us completely. Haley's health seems to be getting better, but her eyes are getting darker. Every day, they're coffee bean brown now, almost black. There's definitely something wrong with this baby. He looked out across the ocean, ignoring the ruined village behind him. The world was dead. The ocean remained. Buried in the shadow of the lighthouse, it seemed to stretch on forever, deep, dark, unfathomable. He looked up to the darkening sky, drawn on by the lonely cry of a circling gull. Perhaps he had remembered better times. Summers past, when this place was filled with laughter of children, when sun-soaked lovers still walked hand in hand. But that was before the plague. Before the Lazarus virus turned the world into a yawning grave, where dead did not rest, but stalked the last vestige of humankind, a terrible hunger. Shivering, he turned up his collar against the cold sea spray, shouldering his pack and heading back into the village, his eyes alert for any form of movement. But there was nothing. No telltale groans, no shambling horror emerged from the shadows. There were only the sighing of the wind and the sound of the ocean as it lapped hungrily at the harbor's concrete sides. He walked on, passing boarded-up shops and crumbling buildings, wary of the slippery seaweed underfoot. The place reeked of decay. The sharp tang of sea salt perfumed the air, and he fancied he could already feel it encrusting his skin. A sign creaked in the groaning wind, and he looked at the sky again soon. Walking around in the light of the day was dangerous enough, but to be caught out after dark was madness, bordering on suicidal. The loss of electricity had turned the night into something more primal. A willing conspirator, the ally of the hungry dead. Hurrying away from the harbor, he climbed a set of slime-covered steps that led up the hill toward the waiting house that seemed to loom above him. Their peeling paint and smashed window only adding to his sense of forbidding and isolation.
Suddenly from behind him came the sound of flapping sails. He spun around, weapon raised, heart beating hard in his chest. It was only the sound of ancient hulls bobbing and scraping together, their torn sails flapping and twisting in the growing wind that pushed against him, determined to drive him back as if eager to mock his feeble efforts. And why not? What was he now, anyway, but a living parasite in the bowels of a long-dead world? A carrion beast picking over the corpses of a decaying animal, always on the run, too scared to live, too afraid to die. And not for the first time since the compound was overrun on that terrible night of blood and terror did he wonder if he had died like all the rest and was now living in his own version of hell. Yet he went on, driven by a promise to come back to this place. He had something he needed to do, a request ushered forth from bloodied lips, a boon and a last wish he intended to grant. He was cresting the top of the hill now that opened up onto a field where rusting swings creaked and a weed-strewn slide stood like the skeletal remains of some long-dead animal. Memories tried to crowd him, laughing children, a strong hand at his back soaring into the air, the wind on his face. With an almost inhuman struggle, he pushed them away, not feeling the tears on his face as he approached a line of nearby houses. He walked slowly, unslinging his rifle as he passed broken windows and shattered doors, watchful for any sign of movement. His ears attuned for the slightest noise, and he wondered where all the denizens of the village had disappeared to. Or perhaps the sea took them, he thought, with a shudder, down into the dark, down into the deep. Finally, he stopped in front of a house a little apart from the others. The door and windows had all been boarded up, all but one. The right downstairs window was shattered, the boards broken and scattered about the weed-strewn driveway. Curtains stained with what could only be old blood, dried and flaking, flapped at his approach, blowing in the wind as if bidding him welcome. Towing the old boards aside, he slung his rifle across his back and drew his sidearm. And quickly he grabbed up the flapping curtains and yanked them down, giving him his first uninterrupted look inside. Seeing no movement, he climbed into the room, mindful of the broken glass that lay strewn about. The room had once been a living room. A mildew-covered sofa lay overturned in one corner. What was left of a broken, splintered coffee table lay smashed on what had once been a furry white rug, now knotted and covered with mold. The wallpaper was slime-covered and peeling. A damp, putrid smell defiled the air, and he knew one of the hungry dead was near. Slowly, he unbuckled his pack and let it fall to the floor, keeping a wary eye on a nearby door that he presumed led off into the rest of the house. Now free of his burdens, he crept towards the door, gun down by his side. He was just reaching out with a trembling hand when his booted foot came crunching down on a stray piece of glass. From the other side of the door came a low groan as something threw itself against the door. Wincing, he took a step back, licking his lips nervously, his heart jackhammering as the thing behind the door continued its pounding. The door was starting to shake now, small cracks appearing in the splintered wood. The thing would be upon him any minute. Slowly, his mind made up. He lunged forward and threw open the door, catching the thing in mid-swing, causing it to come crashing forward, falling heavily to the floor. With a cry, he just managed to jump out of the way of its twisting fingers. The thing had once been a man, and a big one at that, now dressed in the remains of blackened jeans and a torn t-shirt. With a low groan, it slowly came back to its knees, its gray eyes never leaving his face as it snarled, white foam dripping between its chomping jaws. Finally, he came forward as it tottered to its feet. "Forgive me," he whispered, bitter tears in his eyes. He pulled the trigger, ending the creature's misery in a single shot and an explosion of sulfur-smelling smoke. For a moment, he just stood listening to see if the noise had drawn any unwanted attention.
There was nothing but the lengthening shadows and the poor crumbling figure at his feet. Turning, he chambered another round and headed forward into the house. He was in a narrow hallway now, a set of carpeted stairs that led to the next floor. He ignored the stairs and walked down the hall, not looking at the pictures that hung on the walls, as he headed towards a door that lay wide open, revealing a dusty-looking kitchen within. Taking a deep breath, he darted his head across the threshold, taking in the room in a quick glance. There was nothing. Nothing but sagging cabinets, a rusty-looking sink, and a long breakfast table covered in a dusty plastic tablecloth, and a door. A closed door, leading out into a backyard, but it was not this door that drew his attention. It was the other door. The small door built into the back of the room. It was this door he stumbled over to, resting his cheek heavily against the cold wood. There was a sound coming from behind it, a low groaning. Perhaps the clinking of chains. Fumbling in his pocket, he drew out a small torch and threw open the door, his gun pointing down into the darkness. It was the smell that sent him reeling back. The smell of rot and the sharp tang of vinegar. Cursing, he slammed the door and staggered back, leaning heavily against the kitchen table where he was noisily sick. He stayed that way for some time, bent over, breathing hard, before standing and wiping the cold sweat from his brow. "Okay," he muttered. "Okay, let's get it done." Once again, he threw open the door and ignored the smell. Heading down into the darkness, his light cutting through the murk like a laser beam, taking in the destruction all about him. Glass lay scattered all about, puddles of sharp-smelling vinegar and black rotting vegetables stained shattered pieces of wood and old shelving, but he hardly noticed any of this as his torch fell upon the woman tied to a nearby wall. She wore the remains of a summer dress, her long blonde hair matted and filthy. She saw him and went wild, straining against the ropes that had been hastily tied about her waist, securing her to a nearby pipe. Over time, she had managed to wiggle her arms free, leaving a goodish amount of flesh behind. She strained towards him, her filthy blackened fingers twisting, eager to tear his flesh. He felt something welling up inside him and clamped his teeth down hard, locking the scream behind his lips. He raised his gun, his hand rock steady, and fired, pulling the trigger over and over again. He was screaming now, his eyes stinging, his throat clogged with gun smoke. At last the creature lay still. Turning, he fled upstairs. He had to finish this before his resolve crumbled. He did not stop. He didn't hesitate, but threw the door open that led into the backyard and fell into the coming night. The boy didn't move, even when he called his name. "Sean," he whispered, the last of his defenses crumbling as he looked at his brother. It was exactly as he last saw him all those years ago. His big brother Sean, now his little brother, frozen in time like some wretched lost boy. A waif staring up at the moon in his Thomas the Tank Engine pajamas. "Sean!" he cried out, crawling towards the boy. "I came back for you, Sean. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The boy turned, his gray eyes filled with moonlight, and stumbled forward, arms outstretched, a low groan falling from his slack lips. The man held out his arms. "Sean," he whimpered. The boy fell into his arms for a moment. They knelt, and it seemed to the man a glint of recognition flashed in the boy's face, but was gone, replaced by a terrible hunger. Hissing, the boy lunged forward, tearing into the man's shoulder. He didn't struggle or cry out as he raised the gun and rested it against the boy's head. "Forgive me, Sean," he said, and pulled the trigger. The boy went limp in his arms,
and he held him close, and he rested the cold barrel of the gun against his own temple. He thought of his dying uncle, who had saved him on that first night. They had fled. His mother turning and biting his father as he tried to tie her down in the basement, and his father foaming at the mouth, biting poor Sean as he fled into the yard to escape. Then, coming after him, his uncle fighting his father off, grabbing him up, escaping, smashing through the boarded-up window. Sounds of sirens, fire in the night, and finally, the compound. Now gone like everything else, and his promise to come back, to lay his family to rest. The world had fallen into ruin. There was only him, this poor, wasted boy in his arms. A single tear ran down his face and fell onto the dead boy's cheek, reflecting the moonlight. I'm coming, Sean. It's a rare and welcome night that I don't dream of the man who wouldn't die. For over 30 years, he's been haunting my sleep. And for 30 years, I've always wondered to myself if he was out there somewhere, looking for me. 2 months ago, I got my answer, at least partly. I was in my cell, staring at the same cracked walls I've been seeing since 1979, when a guard came by my cell with an envelope in his hand. Mail. For me? I asked. Yes, for you. Mark de Rosario. Oh. The last time I got a letter was 1984, from my cousin, telling me that Mom had died. I got up and he handed it through the bars. Who the hell would write me, I thought, as I sat down onto my little cot and ripped it open. Inside was a postcard. On the back was, "Wish you were here," in white over a typical Florida sunset. The bright light radiated out over the water. Mark, it's been forever, it opened. How's Sing Sing? Nothing's much changed with me. Well, I have my head back on my shoulders and all, but that's a given. Did you know Tony D died last year? I saw him down in hell. He's waiting for you. Love, S. I woke up in the prison infirmary. They found me on the floor, a minor stroke. They airlifted me out of here and into the Northern New York Medical Center and Coates University. I'm weak and exhausted, but I'm alive. I almost wish I hadn't, though. Dead would be better. God help me. He's alive. I've whacked a lot of guys in my day, somewhere in the hundreds. I can't remember the exact number. I had them all recorded in about a dozen notebooks, but the DA's office confiscated them when I was arrested. But not him. He's the only one to ever get away. His name was Sam. Sam Falwell. He was a mob groupie. The kind of guy who hangs around and pretends he's just another good fella, when in actuality he's really nothing. Not even an associate. He was popular with some of the younger guys. Whenever he was in the suit, the mob-owned bar in Queens, he'd sit in a back booth with a bunch of dudes laughing and drinking. Vinny, the capo in those days, hated the motherfucker. He said that he was plotting against the family, trying to recruit guys to help him. Vinny didn't much like anybody, so I just ignored it. Like I said, Sam was a wannabe whatever. Leave the guy alone, let him pretend. The way he looked didn't have much going for him. Tall and lanky, a little on the youngish side. He would have been anywhere from 20 to 40. He wore cheap clothes and looked just a little slow. That's it. Until I actually got a good look at him one night when he was actually going to the pisser. His eyes were livid and evil. His grin froze my blood. His face was craggy and perpetually masked by shadows. He was creepy. I mean, real fucking creepy. The first time I ever talked to the guy was in late September of '75, I think. It might have been October. He came in about 10 on a Saturday night, and his usual gang wasn't around. He stood awkwardly in the middle of the bar for a moment before he sat down next to me at the bar.
"How you doing?" he asked. I gave him a sidelong glance. All right. "Good. I'm Sam. Pleased to meet you." "Mark," I said, and we shook. His hand was hard and cold. He flashed a toothy smile and bought me a drink. "So talk to me. What's going on? How's business?" "What business?" I asked innocently. "Whacking people." I nearly choked on my vodka. "Hey, buddy, look, I don't know what you're thinking, but..." Sure, he smiled again. "You're a travel agent." That was what I said when pushed. It seemed like a clever little joke. Travel agent, arranging trips to the afterlife. Yeah, I am." "And maybe you can send me on a trip one day." I shrugged. "Maybe. Where you want to go?" He took a long sip of his drink. "Ever heard of the Wastelands?" "Nah. Where is it? Utah?" He chuckled. "Oh, no. It's in another dimension." "Sure." He laughed. "You like magic?" "No, I don't." I was starting to get annoyed. The last thing I wanted was some wannabe busting out parlor tricks. "Why not, Mark? Magic is great." I took a long, slow drink, thinking of what to say. I could tell him to fuck off. Yeah, if you're 8. Sam shook his head. "I'm talking about the real stuff." "Real stuff, huh?" He nodded. "Yeah, like this." He reached over and passed a hand over my glass. I yanked it back, sloshing some of it onto the counter. "What the fuck are you doing?" "Take a sip." I looked down at the glass, checked for any powdery residue. Bastard probably slipped me a roofie so I'd pass out, leaving my asshole unguarded. I didn't see anything. "The fuck did you put in my drink?" "Nothing," Sam said. "Take a sip." Never taking my eyes off him, I took a little nip. It tasted like Dr. Pepper, Sam said. I looked back down at the vodka, mystified. It was still clear. I took a large swallow. If that shit wasn't Dr. Pepper, then I'm the Queen of England. "That's a simple trick that most anyone can learn," Sam said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a $50 bill. "Check this out." He tore it down the middle, slapped each half onto the smooth countertop. "See?" I nodded. "Yeah." "Okay, good. Watch this." He covered it with his hand and said, "Abracadabra," and pulled his hand away. $200 bills sat crisply before him. "Cool," I said. I don't know how he made my liquor taste like fucking soda, but I knew exactly how he did that one. Sam had a few tricks up his sleeves, if you know what I mean. "Isn't it? I could teach you to do shit like that if you want. I've been showing some of the other guys. You gotta keep quiet about it, though." I nodded. "Yeah, maybe." "Okay, good. You have a good night. Early to bed, early to rise. Hey, give Carl my love." He went to get up, but I snatched the motherfucker by the back of his coat and dragged him back down. "The fuck did you just say?" He grinned. "I just told you to tell your boyfriend I said hi." I leaned closer until we were nose to nose. "Listen, you piece of shit. If you think you're gonna blackmail me..." "Why would I do that?" he asked. "I don't have anything against the guy." "Fuck you," I spat. "How do you know about him?" No one knew about Carl. We met at a club on the Lower East Side in 73 and saw each other on the weekends. We were discreet, very discreet. "Magic," Sam said, and yanked away. "See you Friday?" I didn't reply. I wanted to kill the son of a bitch right there. "Yeah," I said. Sam smiled and left. Vinny came over. "You all right?" he asked, settling his titanic bulk onto the stool next to me. "I'm gonna whack his ass," I muttered, downing my drink. I forgot it was Dr. Pepper. "What'd he do?" I shook my head and licked my lips. "I'm gonna fucking kill him." Vinny looked around, and then, satisfied he wouldn't be heard, leaned conspiratorially in. "Look, I'm not supposed to say anything, but I talked to Mama over the weekend." Mama was the head of the family, and had been since her husband, Vincent, the guy who started the family, died back in the 60s.
One of the guys who hangs out with Sam says he's planning to overthrow Mama. Take the family over, just like I said.
Yeah?
Yeah. So there's some serious shit coming down in the next few days. Sam's buddies? Done. They're getting whacked. You want Sam, take him, but take him quick.
I nodded. All right. 2 days later, it was Friday, and I was ready. I drove over to the Suit in the golden September sunshine and parked at the curb under a red and gold-covered tree. Inside it was dim and dank, like the den of a vampire bear. At the end of the bar, Willie Carlone sat nursing a gin. He was a small, thin old guy with a bushy unibrow and faded blue eyes. His clothes were always baggy and wrinkled, like his flesh, and his teeth were yellow and jagged. He'd been with the family since the beginning, when Vincent LaRaza started making illegal alcohol in the 1920s. I sat next to him, ordered a rum and coke. "Hey, Willie, what's going on?" "Oh, nothing," he replied. "Just having breakfast." He cackled like a witch. "Hey, do you have Sam's number?" Willie was one of Sam's pupils. The only one over 25 or so. "Yeah, you want it?" "Yeah, that'd be great." He whipped out a pencil stub and jotted it down on a cocktail napkin. "Joining the gang?" "You bet." I drove back over to my apartment and changed into a pair of jeans and a flannel lumberjack shirt. I looked like a fucking farmer. Good. 2 hours later, I was in Jersey. I pulled my car into the parking lot of a hardware wholesaler and killed the engine. Inside, I wandered the aisles until I found the Quick Line. Bought a huge bag of the shit, paid in cash. Back at home, it was 3 o'clock. I called the number Willie gave me. Sam picked up on the first ring. "Mark, what's up?" My heart sputtered. How did he know it was me? And then it hit me. Willie told him. Old fucker. If he was still alive at the end of the day, I'd see if I could whack his ass too. "Hey, Sam," I said. "I was wondering if you could come over here later, before we all meet at the suite." "Sure, what's up?" "I want you to, give you a crash course," he supplied. "Yeah, sure thing. 6 all right?" Actually, it was the exact time I had in mind. Weird. Fucking weird. "Yeah." "All right, I'll see you then." I picked up the phone and sat there for a moment, my heart beating faster than it should have. Magic is bullshit, isn't it? At 5:30, someone knocked at the door, startling me. I was in the kitchen, baking a batch of special cookies for Dickhead, and nearly dropped my spatula. Already? I went into the living room, opened up the door as he knocked again. It was Tony DeSimone, one of the guys in the crew. He was a tall, lanky guy, and today he was wearing a pair of plaid pants and a blazer. "Tony," I greeted. "You look like shit." He laughed. "Yeah, I threw this on as a disguise." "Why?" "Vinny told me that you were going to ice that Sam guy. Thought I'd help." Tony liked killing people. Simple as that. "I don't really need any help," I started. But Tony already shouldered past me. "Yeah, sure you do. Sam's a big guy. How you going to do it?" "Poison." Tony looked at me like I was crazy. "Poison? What are you, a woman?" "Fuck you." Tony laughed. "Take it easy," he said. "I'm just playing with you." I nodded. I guess I was a little too sensitive. "How you going to do it?" "Cookies." Tony shrugged. "Yeah, it's a good plan." They were done by 6. I had just gotten them onto a plate and sat them on the kitchen table when another knock came at the door. "Got it," Tony called. I imagined Sam saying something about my secret as soon as he saw Tony. "Your gate too?" And my heart leapt. Before I could stop him, he had the door open and Sam was inside, laughing and joking. "Mark, how's it going?" "All right. Smells good in here." "I made cookies," I said, leading Sam and Tony into the kitchen. "They're good," Tony said. "I ate about 50 of them." Sam chuckled. "I'm famished. Give me some." He sat down like a man on a 5-course dinner. "Got milk?" "Sure," I said, getting out of the fridge and pouring a tall, frosty glass. I sat it down in front of him, just as he was crunching into his third cookie. I took Tony aside and told him to get the quicklime from the trunk of my car. He nodded and rushed off. "So, Sam," I said, sitting down across from him, "tell me more about magic." "Sure," he said. "Just let me finish this." 5 minutes later, the cookies were almost gone. I'd never used poison before, so I had no idea how long it was supposed to work before it kicked in. Hopefully not that long. "My compliments to the chef," he said, as he ate the last one, and then downed his milk. He pulled out a silver case and took a cigarette out. "We'll get started once I smoke this." I nodded. Behind Sam, Tony was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall. He looked impatient. "Hey, Sam, I'll be right back." "Sure." In the hall, Tony sighed.
How long is this shit supposed to take?
I shrugged, lost.
Not this long.
I put enough in there to kill 6 men. He should be convulsing on the floor right now. Tony nodded.
I got this then.
"No, it's personal."
"Fuck you,"
Tony said.
"You had your chance."
He took a slapjack out of his coat and stormed into the kitchen. Before I knew it, Sam was on the ground convulsing.
"Die, motherfucker!"
Tony screamed and whacked him over the head again and again and again. Finally, Sam was still. A pool of blood spreading across the linoleum. Tony bent down and felt for a pulse. He looked up at me.
"Now that is how you do it."
"I need a cigarette," I said. "Here." Tony tossed me Sam's case. "Give me one." We sat in the hall talking and smoking for a while. For guys like me and Tony, killing was like sex. We sucked down 2 cigarettes each. "Well, we'll wait till dark and take him out," I said. "Got a spot picked out?" "Yeah," I said. It was a plot of land Mama Lorazzo's son, Mario, owned in Jersey. "Good. Now," I got a flash out of the corner of my eye. I turned and met with Sam's bloody face. "Move, bitch," he grunted, shoving me out of the way. Felt like a train hit me. I went down and laid limp like a slug. "Get him!" I screamed breathlessly. Tony shook himself awake and darted after Sam, who was at the door. Tony put him in a headlock and wrestled him to the ground. Sam yelled and shouted as Tony rained punches down on his head like a bull. Sam bucked Tony off and jumped to his feet. "Catch me if you can, motherfuckers!" he yelled, and ran up the stairs laughing. "Motherfucker!" Tony roared and leapt up. He bounded up the stairs 2 at a time. A second later, there was a crash. The whole house shook. Aching all over, lungs tight and weak, I stood with the help of the end table and shambled up the stairs. Sam was lying in the hallway. Tony was on top of him, dragging a straight razor across his throat. There was blood everywhere. On Sam, on Tony, soaking into the carpets, spattering the walls. "I thought you said he was dead," I yelled, collapsing on the top step. "Yeah, he was," Tony grunted. He stopped and the knife fell on the floor. He sat there panting and looking at me, his face covered in sweat. "He was fucking dead." "Apparently not," I retorted. "Look, I know how to read a fucking pulse," Tony shouted, getting back to his feet. "I'm telling you, he was dead." Whatever. He's dead now. They must cut his fucking head off." Tony looked down at the serpentine corpse and spat on it. He got that right. We dragged his body back downstairs, left it in the kitchen. As we mopped up the blood, I thought again of Sam's magic. I knew Tony was right. Sam was dead. He was fucking dead. And he came back. No, that's crazy, I told myself. Tony knocked Sam out and misread the pulse, that's it. But the arsenic, that should have kept him down. "All right," Tony said, startling me. I was on my knees in the hall trying to get the blood out of my carpet. I'd have to replace it. "Let's get him out of here." I nodded and swallowed. "Okay." We went back in the kitchen and I swear to God, Sam was standing at the fridge, pouring himself a fucking glass of milk. He turned to us and smiled, I think. His face was so caked with dried blood, I couldn't tell. "Just getting a drink for the road," he assured us. Tony and I, we just stood there, frozen in place. Neither one of us could have moved, even if Satan himself was behind us. I felt like a man watching a zombie stumble out of a dark crypt in an old Roger Corman movie. It was so so surreal. I guess so totally unbelievable and mind-shatteringly insane. There was no way he was alive and well enough to be chugging milk. Finally, after what felt like 1,000 years, Tony pulled his gun out of his coat and fired without even aiming. The first bullet struck Sam in the gut, ripping it open in an exaggerated shower of blood and intestines. He stumbled back, dropping his glass, and the second one caught him above the left eye, obliterating his skull. He spun, seemed to tiptoe, and then fell over. Tony stood, heaving like a man who just run a marathon, sucking in air and blowing it out in great gusts. The report hung heavy in the air, seemed to linger. Oh shit, it hit me. I had neighbors. There was no way in hell they didn't hear the roar of the gun. In the confined kitchen, it was as loud as artillery fire. Tony was looking at me. That wasn't such a good idea, was it? Fuck, no, it wasn't, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. At least it took him down, Tony said, walking over to Sam's body. What are you doing? I asked. The cops are coming. Tony didn't acknowledge me. Wary and tense, he regarded the body. He toed his head once, twice, 3 times, then bent down and with his razor, severed the bastard's head and gouged his eyes out. When he was done, we looked at each other. I took a deep breath. Tony, I almost pleaded. The cops. Okay, take care of the blood. I'll deal with Sammy. As it turned out, no one called the cops after all. I had a reputation in the neighborhood, so people were more likely to mind their business when it came to me than anyone else. Thank God. It made sense afterward, but in the heat of the moment, I knew some noisy fuck had picked up their phone. We waited for an hour. By then, we were out of the woods. Cops in the city were overworked, but not that damn much. All right, let's get out of here, Tony said. He wrapped Sam in a tarp from my garage. Outside, it was dark and muggy. I moved my car from under the orange glare of the arc sodium street lamp, and then ran back inside to help Tony carry the body down the car. We opened the trunk and threw him in. Hey, what are you guys doing? Someone yelled from their front porch. None of your fucking business, Tony yelled, slamming the trunk. Hey, fuck you, buddy. How about I call the cops? Yeah, great. There goes my grand reputation. Yeah? Tony shouted back. How about I kill your whole fucking family? I tried to hold him back, but he pulled away. Yeah, you try it, asshole. Tony broke into a run. The guy on the porch, a form in the darkness, screamed in terror. 5 minutes later, Tony came back, his hands covered in blood. Piece of shit. Jesus, Tony. You're gonna get us pinched. No one talks to me like that. Let's go. Did you kill him? No. No, I didn't kill him. Probably broke his fucking nose. But he had it coming. Taught him some fucking manners. I sighed. You can't run around doing shit like that. One day, you're gonna meet someone who doesn't play fair. Yeah, Tony asked as we slipped into the car. Then we're gonna wind up buried out in Jersey. He pulled away from the curb and set a course for Jersey. From there on, the ride was quiet and hot, and the only sound the humming of the tires. We were both thinking of Falwell. We stopped only once at the truck stop off the interstate, grabbed a few burgers, some gas cans, which I filled as Tony wolfed down his food. The smell of it made me sick. I had to fight to keep from puking. I'm not hungry, I said. You can have mine. We reached the plot, a grassy field in the woods, about 2 hours after we left. We parked at the bottom of a gentle hill and kicked the engine. What if he's alive again? I asked fearfully. He won't be. He doesn't even have a head. Last time he had a slit throat and a gut full of arsenic, but that didn't stop him. Tony didn't reply. We got out and we went around to the trunk. Tony opened it as I stood back with my gun in my jittering hands. Thank God. Sam was still. See? I told you. As if on cue, the body started moving. First a twitch, then a shuddering spasm. The fuck? Tony yelled, jumped back. I stood there, mesmerized with horror. This can't be happening, I told myself, even as dark laughter started to rise from the trunk, This can't be fucking happening. Jesus Christ, man. For the first time all night, Tony sounded scared, or at least as close to scared as a guy like him can come. Are we there yet? Tony asked, his voice muffled. Those words, even more than the laughter, shattered my soul. I think I lost my mind a little bit. Behind me, Tony was shouting. I didn't hear what he was saying. I was too terrified to move, to hear, to even see. Get out of the way! I heard that loud and clear, only because at that precise instant, Tony shoved me aside and knocked me to the ground. The impact forced the breath out of my lungs and my mind back to this rightful place. I don't know how many rounds Tony fired, but it was a lot. The reports seemed to last a lifetime, one after the other, echoing in the night. Silence when it came was deafening. Tony stood by the trunk, heaving like a man who just ran a marathon. When he finally spoke, his voice was breathless and strained. Where's the nearest town? The question was lost on me. What? Nearest town. Where's the last town we passed? I racked my brain. 5 miles, I think. Good, he said, tucking his gun into his belt. He went around the car, opened one of the back doors, and took out the gas can. He upended it over the trunk, spidered Sam's body. We're leaving this car. I got to my feet. I didn't care at that point. Done. Tony struck a match and dropped it into the trunk. Frames whumped into life, crackling and swaying in the cold night breeze. The smell of gas and burning clothes filled the air. The heat was incredible. You got your gun? I nodded. Yeah. On our way out, hit the tank. Okay. We waited until the fire had died down a little before we left. It took me 3 shots before I hit the tank. The car exploded. We walked 3 miles to a service station along the highway, called a ride, and never spoke of it again. I did my best not to think about it. Did a pretty good job, too, when I was awake. Every night, though, all those repressed fears and what the hell ever else came to the surface and tortured me. I got so bad around 78 that I tried to kill myself. I was always tired, always nervous, always struggling to keep from breaking down. It wasn't worth it. I took an overdose of sleeping pills, but Carl found me, took me to the hospital. I wish he'd never done that. I got better for a few years, but then it all started over again. A prison psychiatrist I talked to back in '88 told me I needed to open up about the whole thing, that I had to rob it of its power by not trying to repress it, whatever. It's bullshit. Didn't help. Nothing has. There's no escape.
Hey there kids, it's me, Mr. Creepypasta, and I just wanted to tell you thank you so much for watching tonight's video. Or listening to tonight's podcast on the podcast, if you're listening to that there at Spotify or Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or wherever you can happen to listen to podcasts. I wanted to remind you guys also that my wife sells loose leaf tea at etsy.com/shop/ivorymonocletea. She has different teas, including Creepypasta teas, and you can get a Mr. Creepypasta tea. If you ask for a dabbing sticker, she also has those. And of course, I wanted to give a big thank you to everyone who checks out patreon.com/MrCreepypasta and supports the show, keeps the light on, gives me treats for my now 2 cats, both Hylas and Hercules. Both of them are a handful. And especially a big thank you to Haha Saha, Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Mazakine, Ken Lenda Higuchi, Champinski, Nico Kao, Tristan Pelton, Stephen Van Huss, Chance Burnett, Diana Kraus, G. Weevil 3, The Red Oak Shield Virus, Hades' Nephew, Carter Barenfanger, Dr. Strawberry, Jordan Wayne Deckart, Bradney Lipe, The Government Monitoring System, Ann Charon, Rumble Fox, Acid System, Mike Bullock, Rafael Rodriguez, Dan Sweet, Mad Marstomp, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation Society, Sean Mills, Brian Arce, Cryptic Nightmares, Shadow Morningstar, Somber Puppet, Brianna Wright, Someone You Love, Said the King 56, Bad Honey, S-Man, Kiri the Sloth, Patrick Schoolmeister, Thomas Burgett, Barbara Maceo, Bobby Carmen, Liam Newman, The Homeless Bird 93, Sky Harbor, Caleb Dougal, Last Blade Song, Eliminator 86, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, and Corey X Kenshin. A big thank you to all of you guys and everybody down there in the description. I really can't thank you guys enough for supporting the show. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And everybody who listens. Sweet dreams.